try to introduce myself. Like, my name is Dennis Tran. I'm a senior postdoc here, but I'm also a multifaceted storyteller, speaker, consultant, and most of my and I use pronoun he, him, and so oftentimes it's like, and my identity is like I'm an Asian man with black hair, black glasses, a black long shirt with patterns, and a maroon shirt underneath, and a black flat pants. And today, through my speaking engagement today, I was here to talk about how the evolution of my journey of a disability person started off as from blindness to how culture, neurodivergence, and community has shaped my understanding and growing understanding of what it means to be disabled and how I can advocate myself for today. So growing up in the 90s, as I come to understand myself into two sectors, being Asian American and low income. And through that aspect of it, growing up in the 90s, like I grew up around with a lot of immigrant family, growing up in a community where we don't talk about mental health, we don't talk about disability, we don't talk about neurodivergence. So I didn't really understood much about like what these things are. I only observed them firsthand. And for me, it's like watching my dad growing up, like with gout and glaucoma. Like I often kind of see like why things are kept in the family. There's a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of shame in the community where like we don't talk about these things. But also, I kind of saw how people started avoiding and distancing themselves away from these conversations, and that became like what I kind of observed as like how people treated disability in the community, but also like how I come to understand it, and that's how I was raised growing up. And so most of the time, as I learned over the years, it's like Asian American, oftentimes people often like oversimplify complex identities, especially with the Asian American community as an example, where Asian American, oftentimes people shrink it as one experience, one community, and one lived reality. However, we're not a monolith. Asian American consists of 50 plus ethnic groups. Like I for myself am a first gen Vietnamese American, Southeast Asian American. However, a lot of times people associate that with being East Asian, and oftentimes that's not true because there's also other types of Asian as well, with Burmese, Hmong, Pakistani, Cambodian, Malaysian, and so forth, are various composed of 50 plus ethnic group. We're not a monolith, and as I learned later in my own experience as well, like disability is not a monolith. You have met one person with that experience in reality. And so my first understanding of disability, actually living it through it myself, was at the age of 17 when I was becoming diagnosed with glaucoma in a very severe state that caused me to become visually no vision and like partially blind. And for me, it's like I associate that with my dad growing up because oftentimes the struggle that I had of being different and not feeling connected into the world was like how I saw my dad not being able to like be accepted from other people by society and culture and avoidance. I kind of saw that through my own peers and through people not knowing how to react to someone with disability or like someone who was like low vision and partially blind. So I blame a lot of myself onto that understanding of myself as like someone who's I was not good enough to fit in. And so a lot of times, like a lot of disabilities, like look like someone wearing cane, walker, something you can actually see. But oftentimes, disability looks like someone who's just smiling and laughing, and just like being uplifting all the time. And that was me for like most of my life. For over 2 decades of my life, I was always a happy kid, smiling, laughing all the time. But beneath the surface, like I was just pretending to be okay and just like adjusting to just push through and to move forward. However, that reality was like no one actually didn't know that I was like going through disability. No one knew that I was like going through a lot of grief of my family passing away. My dad passed away when I was a kid. So I was just kind of showing up school fine and made it through high school, college without any language and to actually advocate for it. So I was just like good and just move on. And that was kind of reality. And oftentimes like people don't think about these things and don't think beyond what they can see. C. It's actually C. And so at the age of 27, which is 10 years after my glaucoma diagnosis, I was diagnosed with autism ADHD. And for so long, I actually struggled to embrace my differences and embrace like why I experience the world differently from other people. And I often kind of thought about like how people have different manual script than me, and why I didn't really kind of fit into social communication and struggle with those types of things for so long. And for me, it's just having that ADHD diagnosis, like a decade later, really stopped forcing myself to blame myself on just being low vision and blind, because I thought that was a problem for so long. But having this really clearly understand how I experienced the world was very differently than social norm. And so once I kind of have the language and understanding of my own identity, today I kind of experience my layers of different identities as like, before I used to separate them as like understand them on a silo basis, where I used to thought about like being Asian, low income, autism, ADHD, and glaucoma as separate experiences. But today I embrace them as like all sorts of, all inseparable aspects of my own identity, that they're all interconnected. Such as Asian low income shape how I kind of understand how disability is taught in my own culture and how it's being viewed and the cultural statement that shaped me. The autism ADHD really just helped me to understand how social connection, how I experience the world is very different from social norm, and the way I think, the way I learn, the way I communicate, the way I interact with the world. And the glaucoma and low vision is like how I can connect with the world, but also kind of navigate workplace and barriers and transportation accessibility. These are things that like impact me. So to consider the whole person of who I am, you have to consider all these different aspects of me. And so once I had the language and understanding of my own journey and identities, I started my own podcast because Asian Lifing, where 5 years ago, where I didn't really saw anyone like myself like coming out to talk about my own disability and neurodivergence. So I was like, I really want connection, I want community. So I started sharing my story 5 years ago. And that led me to build the first Asian American Disability Organization, AADI, where we kind of create resources for community, and that's just kind of helping people that feel less seen and less alone. And that also kind of led me into the Entertainment and Media Fellowship with Disability Law, formerly Respectability, where I shape media representation and kind of advise on authentic representation in media. And that led me to one of my most transformative moments of working with the Fox Family Foundation as their early fund fellow in 2022, where I first evolved with the organization over time. When the organization first started, we focused on the blind and low vision community, where but oftentimes where I kind of hosted a vision fair. But over time, we realized that as we heard over here, I'll talk now, disability and being part of the blind and low vision community is only one aspect of someone's experiences. They also could have neurodivergent, autism, ADHD, or they could be diagnosed with other physical disability that is connected to that, and that there's no single experiences that shape them. And so I really appreciate how the foundation has shifted into incorporating universal design and to all disability to kind of incorporate the full aspect of helping to build a world where everyone can participate and belong in society and to take up space as they are and own their differences. And so to building curriculum, to empowering youth and others to kind of interact with universal design, but to also host podcasts and conversations with change makers and advocates alike. And some of the main aspect of the role I got to take is I'm a very notable speaker who's spoken at university, nationwide conferences, to ERG group, company group, to educate people about disability and neurodiversity inclusion. But more importantly, I'm very passionate about advocating for reshaping perception in the AAPI community, which is the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community, and to kind of help them to shift their perspective of what it means to be disabled and Asian American. And also, to be the change I wish I want to see in the world, and to be the reputation I want to see in the world because I never saw myself being represented in screen, to shaping one of the first autistic character on Blue's Clues and universe, like impacting millions around the world and globally as well. To this past year, creating my own short film, Crosswalk, which is to kind of educate community about, to share my story about being autistic and neurodivergent and how it show up in society being misunderstood, and to being a part of the community nonprofit leadership program to impact the community around the world. And so none of this work would have been possible without the impact of shared lived experiences and representation, but also community. Because if I didn't have met people like Dr. McHugh who shared my lived experience as someone who's late diagnosed with autism and ADHD, who's queer, who's also Southeast Asian, but also the community, the disability community at large, and what the blind, low vision, and just seeing other representation of people who look like me really helped me start to embrace myself. And it took me 25 plus years to kind of start to see myself very differently, to actually understand shifting myself to understanding who I am, but also giving the language access to understanding the various identities that shape me. And so a lot of times I grew up kind of internalizing all the messages and stories of what people say I should be, the negative medical model of what needs to be disabled, blaming myself a lot and putting a lot of pressure on myself, and to the cultural stigma and the model minority myth in Asian community of all Asian are hardworking, pushed down, to push through. But oftentimes I also internalize those messages for myself of just push through, to keep going. And for me, I kind of suffered in silence for so long that I had to kind of unlearn all these messages of that, and community helped me with that, representation helped me with that, and kind of seeing other lived experience really helped me unlearn all these messages about myself. And today, after 25 plus years, I started to own my differences and own my different layers of who I am as a superpower, as a strength. So today I own what it means to be disabled, neurodivergent, my culture, my lived experiences, and then to be able to empower the community to kind of do the same thing. And it's not that we should ask permission to take up space anymore. We need to be able to own our differences and be able to hijack those spaces so that we can actually co-design, co-develop solutions to be the world. Because I also often say that disabled people are innovators and co-creators, especially living in a world that isn't built for us. So for me, it's as I want to live here, stay here, it's through my own story and lived experience, I hope you take away that not all disabilities are just one experiences. They're all layers that are compacted by intersectional realities and identities, and that we're not all a monolith. And that to truly build an inclusive world, we have to consider these factors and these variables of what makes people experience are, and we have to consider the whole experiences, the whole journey of those experiences, and the whole person. Thank you.
Could you share with the crowd the importance of your Asian Lifing podcast to the autistic community who did not have a voice?
I think when I first started the podcast, I didn't really have a language or truly understand what the disability community was. It was just me I just want to share my story about what it's like to navigate through mental health challenge and being late diagnosed with autism, ADHD, but also being blind, low vision impaired. I think for me it's having that aspect was the start to the very long journey of the 5-year journey I have now, where it was a conversation starter of not a lot of people talk about mental health, not a lot of people talk about disability, not a lot of people talk about neurodivergence, and so for me it's because no one really talks about this stuff, it's I'm really carving a path forward for the community, and to be able to kind of share the experiences. I remember just first share my story because I just want to get it out there and just have an outlet to share my story, but since then it reaches thousands of people globally, but also for me to be able to be invited to speaking opportunities, consulting opportunities, and it's very open door for me, but also helping the community grow with it as well, to have started this conversation of what it means to be disabled, what it means to be Asian, what it means to be neurodivergent, because oftentimes there was none existed out there, especially in 2021, where it was during the pandemic, where people are starting to figure out their disability, their neurodivergence, and So we didn't have language for that stuff. So for me, it's like it was a kickstart to a lot of impact work I do today.